Lookout Fleet realizes the haze is an iceberg and rings the warning bell 3 times. He phones the bridge, with Officer Moody answering the call. Sixth Officer Moody turned to Officer Murdoch and relayed, "Iceberg right ahead, sir." First Officer Murdoch ordered, "Hard to starboard" to Quartermaster Hitchens while ringing stop on the engine telegrams. Hitchens then began to turn the wheel hand over hand. Hitchens reports that the helm is hard over, and Sixth Officer Moody relays to First Officer Murdoch that the helm was hard over. First Officer Murdoch throws the warning bell for the watertight doors to be shut. Titanic strikes the iceberg, opening up small seams along her starboard side. First Officer Murdoch activates the watertight door system, causing the doors to begin to close. He orders hard a port to Hitchens just as the iceberg passes by the bridge wing. Captain Smith arrives on the bridge just after Officer Boxhall. Smith inquired as to what they had struck, and Officer Murdoch tells him of the encounter with the iceberg. Smith then ordered for the watertight doors to be shut. He, Officer Murdoch, and Officer Boxhall then walked to the starboard bridge wing to inspect damage. Shortly after, Officer Boxhall departed quickly for a tour of the bow. Down below inside Titanic, the water began to pour into 6 watertight compartments, most noticeably into Boiler Room 6. The seam into Boiler Room 6 was open 2 feet above the floor, and came in with the strength of a fire hose. Boiler Room 5 was also compromised, but its flooding was controlled for the time being by closing off the doors to the coal bunker where the water was coming in. Lookout George Hogg, who had been off duty at the time of the collision, ran up to the forward well deck to have a look around after hearing noise. He didn't see anything out of place at the moment, so he returned back inside the ship. Bosun Joseph Scarrett had been smoking nearby and also ran to the forward well deck with a group of fellow crewmen. This group found a large quantity of ice and snow on the starboard side. Not thinking too much of the situation, they departed back inside while cursing the iceberg for disturbing their peace. Captain Smith ordered a slow-ahead order to the engine room via the bridge telegrams, and Titanic began to move forward slowly in the ocean once again. Officer Boxhall, on his tour of the bow, arrives at the forward well deck. Without noticing the ice accumulated on the starboard side, he descends further into the bow. During his tour, he would travel no further down than F deck and would see no immediate signs of damage. Second Officer Lightoller had awoken around this time and came out onto the boat deck. He took note that the ship had slowed down to around 6 knots, but that it was proceeding forward very slowly. He spotted Officer Pipman nearby and conversed with him for a short while before they both returned to their cabins afterwards. On the bridge, Captain Smith ordered for Quartermaster Oliver to find the carpenter and have him take a draught of the water. In the engine room, trimmer Patrick Dillon observed the engine starting to go ahead slowly. Passengers up on deck and inside the ship began to comment that they noticed that the engines were not vibrating at the full speed that they had grown accustomed to during their voyage. For many on the ship unaware of the collision, this alteration in the engine vibration was the first sign that something had happened. At approximately 5 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith entered the bridge and noted a 5-degree list to starboard. Upon seeing this, he ordered for another all-stop order to the engine room, and Titanic's engines would come to a stop for the final time. Inside the ship, 2 passengers saw Thomas Andrews descending, and they tried to ask him not to go down. They later stated, "He was on hand at once, and said he was going below to investigate. We begged him not to go, but he insisted, saying he knew the ship as no one else, and that he might be able to allay the fears of the passengers." In the bow, lamp trimmer Hemming discovers that the peak tank is flooding fast from air hissing out of the ventilation pipe above, but he noted that the forepeak tank above it was dry. Chief Officer Wilde had come by and was informed of the situation. Once the engines had been stopped for the final time, steam began to build up, and soon the safety mechanisms were engaged. The noise was described as several steam locomotives going off at once by passengers, and it would last for over an hour. Under the forecastle head on sea deck, forward boatswain Albert Haynes discovered that the forepeak tank was now flooding. He made his way aft and looked down cargo hold number 1 to see the canvas stretched taut over the opening. It began to raise like a bubble as the air escaped from the pressure below. Haynes immediately departed for the bridge to report this finding. The chairman of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, arrived on the bridge at around this time, and he asked the captain why the engines had stopped. Ismay was informed of the collision by Captain Smith and told that the damage may indeed be serious. Ismay departed at once for his cabin to dress warmly after hearing this. Fourth Officer Boxhall entered the forward well deck again after finishing his tour of the bow down to F deck, but he now sees a man holding a chunk of ice the size of a small sink basin. He travels over to the starboard bulwark and notices chunks of ice extending 3 to 4 feet onto the deck. Bruce Ismay runs into Chief Engineer Joseph Bell while returning to his cabin, and he asked him what he thought of the situation. Bell responded that he thought the damage was serious, but he hoped that the pumps could control the incoming ocean. Ismay returned to his suite just long enough to throw on a suit over his pajamas, and he left for the bridge once again. First-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie saw Bruce Ismay making his way up a stairwell with a crew member. He noted that the White Star chairman was dressed in a suit, but was without his customary hat. After catching a look at Ismay's face, he realized the seriousness of the event, remarking, "It occurred to me then that he was putting on a brave face as possible so as to cause no alarm to the passengers." Gracie had previously run up on the boat deck to have a look around shortly after the collision, strolling along both sides of the boat deck. He had spotted nothing, but a few passengers from the first-class smoking room on A deck had run out and spotted the berg as it passed by the ship. These passengers had returned inside to their drinks and card games afterward. Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley had left his cabin to investigate the disturbance, but he returned shortly after to continue reading his book. Within a few minutes, he heard passengers walking about the corridors outside wanting to know why the engines had stopped, stating, "Naturally, with such powerful engines as the Titanic carried, the vibration was very noticeable all the time, and the sudden stopping had something of the same effect as the stopping of a loud ticking grandfather's clock in a room." Officer Boxhall has arrived back at the bridge and reported to Captain Smith that he observed no damage in the bow, but that there was indeed ice in the forward well deck. Back down below in the boiler rooms, Fireman Barrett and Engineer Shepard had begun to climb down into Boiler Room 6 after being ordered out of Boiler Room 5, but they noticed that it was flooded on the starboard side by about 8 feet. They disregard their order to return to their stations in Room 6 and decide to head back again into Boiler Room 5. Steward Johnston in the first-class dining room on D-deck walks forward to the reception room, and he sees Thomas Andrews heading down the stairs to E-deck before turning aft and heading towards the engine room. Water has now begun to enter the orlop deck below the mailroom on G-deck. The 5 postal clerks there began to haul mail bags up from the holds. By the time they had hauled all the bags they could up the stairs, the water had risen considerably towards G-deck. Fireman Hendrickson in the bow is told of water coming in at the bottom of the fireman's tunnel. He confirms this and heads to the engine room to inform his fellow engineers. Captain Smith orders for Officer Boxhall to find the carpenter and have him sound the ship. Boxhall leaves immediately, but he runs into Carpenter Hutchinson coming up the crew stairs from A-deck. He has the carpenter report to the bridge after he is told of water flooding the holds below. Boxhall immediately sets off for the mailroom. At around this time, approximately, Officer Boxhall has reached the mailroom on G-deck, and he sees that water is within 2 feet of the top of the stairwell coming from the hold below. After having received word of damage from Carpenter Hutchinson and the mail clerk, Captain Smith sets off for his own tour of the midships, using crew stairwells as to not cause a panic. He first headed down to E-deck while touring for damage, possibly also heading to personally speak to Chief Engineer Joseph Bell in the engine room. Steward Johnston in the D-deck reception room sees Captain Smith descending the stairs, touring the midships for damage, and calming a few passengers as he went. Boatswain Haynes has now arrived on the bridge and reports to Chief Officer Wilde that he had observed cargo hold 1 flooding. Wilde responded with, "Get your men up and get the boats out." At around this time, the engine room received word to alert all stokers to go up on deck. Greaser Thomas Ranger in the engine room had been in his station for the past few minutes repairing an electric fan when Chief Electrician Peter Sloan ordered him to go and shut down all of the electric fans, beginning with those located in the boiler rooms. Fireman George Beauchamp continues to dampen the boilers in room 6 when he hears someone yell out, "That will do." He and the others abandon the flooding boiler room and they make their way up to the boat deck via Scotland Road. Bosun Albert Haynes has arrived back in the forecastle head crew quarters and he orders for all hands stand by, you may be wanted at any moment. The crew in the bow begin to wake, and they ready themselves to receive further orders. Lookout George Simmons heard this order, and he got out of bed for some coffee, but he was disturbed by a strange sound. Upon looking down the shaft for cargo hold 1 like Haynes before him, he saw that the tarp was now removed from the wooden slats, and he could see the ocean water sloshing around in the holds below. Fireman Threlfall in the bow is awoken by someone shouting nearby. Upon getting out of bed, he has to wade through water from his quarters on G-deck and climb the spiral staircase up. He noted that the water was flowing down the stairs into the stokehold tunnel below. Still in the first-class reception room, Steward Johnston observes Thomas Andrews returning from below decks, now heading towards the mailroom. This time, he follows Andrews, and he sees the first-class baggage room on G-deck is now flooding. Johnston returned up the stairs and found Steward Wheat. He told Wheat of the flooding down below before departing for his room to get dressed properly. Steward Wheat then descended the stairs and watched the mailroom flood. First-class passengers Philip Mock and Emma Shabert had dressed and went out onto the A-deck promenade. When they reached the forward end, they spotted third-class passengers in the well deck down below moving their suitcases and belongings out of their cabins. In his quarters on E-deck near the engine room, Steward Nichols overhears engineers passing along orders to shut all the watertight doors. Nichols found himself unable to go back to sleep and remained in his quarters for around 45 minutes after this, talking with his fellow stewards about what was going on. At around this time approximately, Captain Smith had returned to the bridge after his inspection. He gave the orders for the crew to muster the lifeboats and prepare them for passengers should the need arise. This was a preemptive measure by Captain Smith, as he hadn't yet been made aware of the ship's true condition. Back inside, stewards were continuing to try and calm passengers that had awakened by telling them not to worry, and in some instances, they even told passengers that they would be back underway in their voyage soon. Out on the boat deck, Seaman Bewley hears Officer Murdoch telling the men to get together and uncover the boats. They were to prepare them quietly, as though nothing had happened to avoid a panic because passengers by now had begun to roam the upper decks. Officer Boxhall returns to the bridge, and he informs Captain Smith that the mailroom on G-deck was indeed flooding. Smith responded with a terse "all right," and then departed immediately for his own tour of the bow. Officer Wilde orders Quartermaster Oliver to get the muster list for the lifeboats, and he orders Officer Boxhall to wake Officers Lightoller, Pittman, and Lowe, and have them come out and help prepare the lifeboats. Steward Wheat, still at the stairs on F-deck watching the mailroom flood, immediately struck out for the watertight doors by the Turkish baths to see if the crew had thought to close them. He noticed that both of the doors were indeed still open, so he began to close them manually by himself. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts Hogg and Evans relieve Fleet and Lee early, since they had been awakened by the collision and subsequent clamoring of crew in the bow. The lights come back on in the boiler rooms just as Fred Barrett arrives in boiler room 5 with the lamps. Engineer Hendrickson arrives with lamps for room 6, but he can't enter as the water is already too high there. Hendrickson leaves to join room 5, and he helps in the drawing of boiler fires while Barrett leaves to find more stokers to put the fires out. Lookouts Fleet and Lee arrive under the forecastle head on C-deck, and they see firemen coming up from C-deck with their kits and clothing. They were saying that there was water beginning to flood their quarters down on F-deck. Lookout Lee, like others before him, looked down cargo hold 1, and he saw water rising in the G-deck hold below. A bosun then shouted, "All hands to the boat deck," and the crew began to evacuate the bow. Norman Chambers spotted 3 men who he assumed to be officers inspecting the flooding mailroom and first-class baggage room. The water was within 2 feet of F-deck, and he overheard one of the officers remark, "Doesn't appear to be rising that much." Saloon steward William Ward is awoken and hears third-class passengers traveling along Scotland Road outside of his door. After peeking his head out, he noted that passengers were walking aft with lifebelts in hand. Some of them were even carrying chunks of ice. He thought it was odd, but he still had faith in the ship, so he returned to his bunk. Out on the top deck in the officers' quarters, Officer Boxhall has relayed information about the collision to Officer Pittman. He's attempted to wake Officer Lowe, who instead went back to sleep, and then he approaches Lightoller's cabin. After telling Lightoller that they had struck an iceberg and that the mail room was flooding on G-deck, Lightoller hurriedly got out of bed and started to dress himself. Bedroom steward Thiesinger passes the stairwell to the mailroom, and he observes water flooding the area. Steward Dodd sees him nearby and yells, "All stewards, call your people, warn them to go out on deck." Officer Lightoller emerges from his cabin after getting dressed. He's on the port side, forward section of the boat deck. He spots Chief Officer Wilde nearby and asked if all the hands had been called, which Wilde replied that they had. Lightoller noted that none of the canvas covers had been removed off of the regular lifeboats nearby on the port side yet. Passenger Alfred Nerney had been outside and saw ice in the forward well deck. He immediately traveled to the lowest point of the ship available to first-class passengers, the squash court. When he arrives, he is stunned to find 3 to 6 feet of water in the room. Boxhall arrives on the boat deck after rousing the officers in the deckhouse. He sets to work with the men on the port side, getting the lifeboat covers off of the boats and preparing them to be cranked out. Third Officer Pipman joins everyone else on the boat deck, and he takes note of the situation with the lifeboats. He sees Officer Moody nearby, who tells him that ice has been found in the forward well deck. Pipman then leaves to investigate and evacuate any remaining crew in the bow. Down inside the ship, Stewardess Annie Robinson sees Captain Smith on E-deck with Chief Purser Hugh McElroy. Some stewards inside preemptively begin to tell passengers in their care to dress warmly, put on your lifebelts, and go up on deck. The saloon steward quarters on E-deck, Fred Ray was just starting to get back to sleep when a steward entered the room and ordered everyone to get up and send the passengers up to the boat deck. Officer Pipman arrives in the forward well deck and investigates for structural damage under the forecastle head on C deck. When he enters, he finds firemen coming up from below saying water is coming in. He looks down the cargo hatch and sees that water is down below in G deck before evacuating with the firemen back to the boat deck. Trimmer Patrick Dillon and others are ordered to open all the watertight doors going forward from the engine room to boiler room 4. This was to bring a pipe forward, which would be hooked into the pump systems to pump water out of the ship. The rate of water entering the Titanic was coming in nearly 17 times faster than the pumps could carry out. Elsewhere inside the ship, Annie Robinson sees water 6 steps from coming onto E-deck by the staircase to the mailroom. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews had just left the stairwell, and she overheard Andrews telling Smith, "Well, 3 have gone already, Captain." This was most likely a reference to the amount of flooded compartments that Andrews had observed. Captain Smith left Andrews to his inspection, and he headed back to the bridge to oversee the lifeboat preparations. After evacuating firemen in the bow, Officer Pittman returns to the boat deck, but this time on the starboard side. He sees that the lifeboats have now begun to be uncovered, so he sets out and helping to assist their preparation. Passengers Charles and Annie Stengel have been walking the boat deck when they decide it's time to return in. Charles then sees Captain Smith nearby, coming up a set of stairs with a very serious and grave face. Countess of Roths and Gladys Cherry have been up on deck for a short while and had just begun to talk about returning down to their cabins, when suddenly they saw Captain Smith too. They recalled that he told them, "I don't want to frighten anyone, but will you all go quietly and put on your life belts and go up to the top deck?" Shortly after this, Stewardess Violet Jessup returns inside to see Captain Smith and Purser McElroy. They smiled as they passed, but they didn't say anything. When she turned, Jessup ran into band violinist John Hume and band leader Wallace Hartley, with other members of the band following behind them. Hume remarked to Jessup, "Just gonna give them a tune to cheer things up." Around this time approximately, Captain Smith has returned to the bridge following his tour of damage with Thomas Andrews in the bow. Chief Purser McElroy had departed from walking with Smith, and was now amongst the passengers telling them to go back to their rooms, dress warmly, and get ready to go up on deck and join a lifeboat. Even though the official order had not yet been given, he most likely did this after hearing Captain Smith telling passengers while climbing the grand staircase to do the same. Steward Wheat was just coming up the grand staircase and saw Purser McElroy up above. Wheat heard an order from the purser, "Get the men up and get all the lifebelts, and all the passengers." Wheat then began to go back below and wake up the stewards. Down below, Edwin Kimball and his wife had already dressed and exited their cabin when a young lady of our party came back from the upper deck, and we asked her what was going on up there. She said the order had been given to put on lifebelts. None of us knew how to put on lifebelts, but I saw an officer in the companionway and he showed us how to put it on, telling us that there was no danger and that everyone would be all right. Colonel Archibald Gracie had returned to his cabin to dress warmly. As he came into the first-class entrance, he spotted Bruce Ismay standing with an officer. He again noted that Ismay was smiling at the passengers, but surmised that he was putting on a brave face for them. At approximately this time, Captain Smith gives the official order for the boats to be swung out and for passengers to be called up with their lifebelts on. Crew at the nearby lifeboat stations began to prepare to swing the boats out, while others departed to relay Smith's orders to the aft boat stations. Captain Smith then departed for the Marconi wireless room. He told the operators that the ship had struck an iceberg, and get ready to send out a call for assistance, but don't send it until I tell you. This is most likely because Smith was still waiting for a confirmation that the ship was going to sink before asking the Marconi operators to call for assistance. After receiving the official order, lifeboats began to be swung out on the boat deck. Typically, the forward boats were swung out before the stern boats after. The process for uncovering the boats, preparing them, and then cranking them out generally took about 5 to 10 minutes per boat. Down below in the saloon steward's quarters on E-deck adjacent to Scotland Road, Steward Frederick Ray had just begun to get back to sleep after the noise of third-class passengers traveling down the corridor had died down. Suddenly an order rang out from a saloon steward nearby for everyone to get up, get dressed, and head to their lifeboat stations. And another nearby steward, William Ward, recalled thinking that even though they were being ordered to the lifeboat stations, there wasn't anything significantly wrong with the ship. At this approximate time, the band has gathered at the first-class entrance forward on A-deck and began to play music. It is still debated on what time they moved up and out onto the boat deck. In the first-class lounge, passengers have started gathering after returning inside from the cold. Edith Rosenbaum stated, "The lounge filled with passengers in various stages of undress, many of them indignant at being routed out of bed after midnight. I listened to Colonel Washington Roebling, the builder of the Brooklyn Bridge. Whatever the trouble is, I doubt there's any real emergency. The Titanic has 15 watertight bulkheads, which makes her unsinkable. A leak might slow her down a few knots, but it wouldn't do much more than that." Due to the steam noise overhead from the funnels, the crew find it difficult to pass along orders without shouting. Officer Lightoller said of his time on the port boat deck, "It was an utter impossibility to convey an order by word of mouth, but a tap on the shoulder and an indication with the hand, dark though it was quite sufficient." Up in the crow's nest, Hogg and Evans are curious about the commotion on the boat deck. They look and see people out and about with their lifebelts on. Hogg attempts to phone the bridge, but no one responds. The two lookouts abandon their post and they make their way to the boat deck. Seaman John Poindexter is in the seaman's quarters on E-deck in the bow, trying to find his boots. As he slips them on, the wooden bulkhead separating the quarters from third-class passenger space collapses. 3 feet of water immediately floods the room, and Poindexter immediately departs for the bridge. Down below, Thomas Andrews has observed flooding in cargo hold 1, 2, and 3, the forepeak tank, and boiler room 6. During this inspection, he had urged the crew when he came across them to go up on deck. Now he sets off for the bridge to alert the captain that the ship is going to sink. First-class passenger Anna Warren sees Thomas Andrews rushing up the grand staircase on D-deck. She saw him leaping up the stairs 3 at a time with a look of terror on his face. Just after this, another first-class passenger, William Sloper, saw Andrews on A-deck in a similar fashion. He noted that Andrews said nothing as he passed, but one look at his face convinced Sloper that Andrews was very worried. Quartermaster Hitchens has been standing at his post at the ship's helm during this entire ordeal. Officer Lightoller finally entered the wheelhouse to order him away and start working on Collapsible D's canvas covering. Hitchens was to assist with the other port-side boats when he had finished this task. On the starboard side of the boat deck, Bruce Ismay interrupts Officer Pittman at Boat 5. Ismay remarked that he wanted them to begin loading women and children into the boat. Pittman objected, saying that he was awaiting his orders from the captain before doing so. Ismay relented, but Pittman began to make his way to the bridge to ask Captain Smith personally if he should do so after he realized who the passenger was. Officer Pittman told Captain Smith, "I think Mr. Ismay wishes me to get the boat away with the women and children in it." Smith responded, "Go ahead, carry on." With this news, Pittman returned to the Boat 5 station and climbed aboard. He began to shout above the noise of steam for ladies and children, "Please make your way forward and enter." Bruce Ismay stepped forward and began to help willing passengers and children into the boat as well. Thomas Andrews arrives on the bridge around this time and informs Captain Smith that the incoming water is too much for Titanic to withstand. The pumps, when activated, will not be able to keep up with the flooding. He gives Titanic an hour to an hour and a half to survive. Captain Smith officially gives the order to begin loading all lifeboats with women and children. Seaman Poindexter arrives on the boat deck in time to hear this order. Thomas Andrews, after conversing with Captain Smith, departs back inside the ship to assist in getting passengers up on deck. After giving the order to load the boats, Captain Smith immediately left for the Marconi wireless room. He told the operators, "Send the call for assistance." Phillips responded with, "What call should I send?" Smith said, "The regulation call for help, just that." Officer Boxhall on deck hears someone remark about a light on the horizon off the port bow. He turns and confirms the light. He then sees Captain Smith nearby and asks him, "Should I send a distress signal?" Smith confirms to Boxhall that he had already sent one via the wireless. Boxhall then deduces that their transmitted position over the wireless is incorrect, as it had been determined via the 8 o'clock dead reckoning. Titanic by now was approximately 20 miles ahead of the 8 o'clock DR. Boxhall left for the chart room to plot their actual position for an amended wireless transmission. Down in third class, stewards have begun to try and organize crowds gathering in the stern of the ship. The third class had been evacuating from the bow cabin shortly after the collision, but due to the disorganization, they had all been waiting around for someone to tell them what to do and where to go, mostly in the third class general room and other third class areas. Thomas Andrews sees to it that on C deck, Steward Etches makes sure that all the passengers had left for the boat deck before ordering him to open all the cabin doors, take out all the lifebelts. Opening the doors was to make sure that everyone had left and to let others know that the room had already been checked. If Etches were to find any passengers, he was instructed to assist them in any way necessary to get them up on the deck. Third Class Steward Hart begins to assemble a group of around 30 women and children from third class in the stern. Shortly after assembling this group, he would begin to lead them up to the boat deck toward the lifeboats. Other third-class passengers in the stern would stay where they were, or begin to move out into the aft well deck shortly after. From here, they would have direct access to the B-deck promenade, but the third-class passengers remained in the aft well deck for the time being. Assistant Saloon Steward Nichols makes his way to the boat deck and to his assigned lifeboat station, Boat 15. After passing the gymnasium, he notices several passengers inside. Some of them were even using the equipment. Lookout George Hogg has reached the boat deck by now and is ordered by the bosun to find a ladder. Upon returning with it, First Officer Murdoch orders him into Boat 7 in order to begin prepping the boat for launch. Officer Lowe finally wakes in his cabin in the officers' quarters out on deck due to the growing noise in the corridors. When he steps out of his door, he sees that women and children are waiting in the officers' quarters hallway with their lifebelts on. He hurriedly dresses and rushes out to the port boat deck to assist preparing the lifeboats with others. Lowe is informed of the collision by an officer, and he goes back to his cabin to retrieve his personal revolver. He then makes his way to the starboard boat deck and assists Officer Murdoch with the preparation of Boat 7 for loading and launch. After roaming all over the boat deck, overseeing the lifeboat readiness drills, Officer Lightoller approaches Captain Smith to get permission to swing the boats out. Smith answered in the affirmative, and then the port side boats began to be swung out. On the starboard side, Officer Murdoch is asking for women and children to please step forward and join the lifeboat stations 3, 5, 7. He was not ordering passengers to enter the boats, neither were the other officers at other lifeboat stations. They would ask for volunteers to join the boats, in order to avoid a panic breaking out amongst the passengers. Whenever there were no more willing passengers in the nearby vicinity, the boats would then be launched. By now, Officer Boxhall has completed his calculation of the ship's position via the new dead reckoning. He gives this position to Captain Smith, who in turn hands it back to him and tells him to deliver it to the wireless room. Boxhall arrives at the wireless room but cannot communicate with Jack Phillips and Harold Bride due to the overwhelming steam noise ahead. Verbal communication attempts are abandoned, and Boxhall writes down the new distress coordinates and then leaves to return to the boat deck. Jack Phillips takes note of the piece of paper and amends his wireless signals to broadcast the new coordinates given out by Boxhall: 41 by 46 degrees north, 50 by 14 degrees west. Officer Lightoller came to Smith after the port boats had been swung out and cupped his hands over Smith's ears and shouted over the steam noise, "Hadn't we better get the women and children into the boat, sir?" Smith nodded, "Yes. Put the women and children in and lower away." Steward Etches is helping to clear ropes on deck near Boat 7, when he notices Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet in formal attire, helping usher women into Boats 5 and 7. Etches inquired why they didn't have lifebelts on, and Guggenheim responded, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen. If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty. No woman was left on board this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." On the starboard boat deck, First Officer Murdoch has ran out of willing passengers to board Boat 7. He tells the crew to row a short distance away but stand by the after gangways to receive more passengers later on. Murdoch places Lookout Hogg in charge of Boat 7 and turns to the crew on deck, signaling that the lowering process was about to begin. On the port side, Officer Lightoller has Boat 4 tied to a heavy coaling wire that ran alongside the A-deck promenade in case the ship developed a list or something. He then orders 2 or 3 stewards to find hand cranks to open the windows on the A-deck promenade so the passengers could enter the boats. There is a general confusion in part of the officers and passengers about where they were to join the boats. The normal method would be for the boats to be lowered down to the A-deck promenade, and the passengers would join there. On Titanic, however, the forward half of A-deck was enclosed with windows that were both closed and locked. Passengers could therefore not board the forward boats until the windows have been unlocked. Boat 7 is lowered with only around 28 of its 65 seats filled. Most survivors in this boat stated that they rowed a short distance away, then halted, and then eventually pulled a 1/4 of a mile away from the ship. Passengers still on the starboard boat deck continue to board Boat 5, which decreases the amount of people on deck significantly in that area. Of the crowd of willing passengers, only 2 women refused to enter this boat. The other passengers had retreated back inside the ship for warmth, or they were down in their cabins dressing warmly before returning to the boat deck. Officer Lightoller orders Boatswain Alfred Nichols and 6 others to go below and open the portside gangway door on D-deck, presumably for offloading passengers, as Officer Murdoch had explained to the crew on board Boat 7. On the port side, Ida and Isidore Strauss refuse to be separated at Boat 8. Ida insists upon her maid taking her place in the lifeboat. The 2 retire back inside the ship. After standing by and waiting for the A-deck promenade windows to be unlocked, Officer Lightoller then moves to lifeboat stations 6 and 8 and begins to fill both of them at the same time. Boat 4 will remain stationary outside of the A-deck promenade, locked behind a pane of glass for an hour before the passengers can board it. Officer Lowe is working the falls for Boat 5 when he notices a man step forward and wave his arms, shouting, "Lower away, lower away, lower away." Officer Lowe recognizes the man as Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He scolds him, and Ismay steps back and begins to help load Boat 3 with women and children. Steward Wheat leaves the boat deck to evacuate any remaining crew on F-deck, but he finds the area abandoned. Upon starting up the stairs to E-deck on the grand staircase, he notices a trickle of water coming down the steps quickly, and just deep enough to cover the heels of his boots. Officer Pittman and Steward Etches climb out of Boat 5 and back onto the boat deck, but Officer Murdoch orders both of them back into the boat. Murdoch states, "You go in charge of this boat, old man, and also look after the others. Keep handy to come to the after gangway when hailed. Goodbye and good luck to you." Murdoch then moved to the Boat 3 station to take charge of its loading. Pittman climbed back aboard Boat 5 and ordered, "Lower away." Boat 5 was lowered with 36 of its 65 seats taken. 4 more people would join the boat momentarily. 2 would jump in as the lowering started. Boat 5, once it was free of the Titanic, would tie up alongside Boat 7 after both had launched and rowed away. Officer Boxhall, with the aid of some binoculars, begins to observe the light on the horizon that he had spotted earlier. Upon focusing on the light, he determines that it's actually the two masthead lights of a steamer in the distance. Boxhall immediately stepped over to the morse key on the starboard bulwark of the bridge and begins to attempt to contact the steamer. Captain Smith nearby notices Boxhall's attempt and tells him, "Tell them to come at once. We're sinking." During its descent, Boat 5 begins to dip at an angle towards the bow of Titanic, and lowering is momentarily halted until the boat is evenly trimmed out. While the crew work to level the boat, many women on board begin to call out for their husbands and sons on the boat deck. Hearing this, an officer yells out, "Let the men in! Make haste!" And a few men are allowed entry into the boat before the lowering continues. Captain Smith orders for lamp trimmer Hemming to make sure that the boats were provided with lights. Hemming goes below decks and begins bringing them up 4 at a time for the lifeboats on the boat deck. Officer Boxhall at the Morse key begins to grow impatient at the lack of response by the steamer on the horizon, and he sends up a rocket via the starboard bulwark, mere feet from Boat 1. The rocket travels roughly 600 to 800 feet into the air before exploding with a deafening boom. The white trails of the rockets were reportedly so bright that they bathed the Titanic's decks in full light for a few seconds before fading away. Quartermasters Bright and Rowe on the stern see the rocket explode overhead. When they look over the side of the stern, they see a lifeboat, Boat 7, in the ocean, and they phone the bridge. They're told to gather the extra detonators and report to the bridge immediately. Steward Fred Ray in Scotland Road on E-deck sees water now up to the second funnel casing. He climbs the stairs and begins to make his way to the boat deck. Boat 5 reaches the water, but the falls are not released on time. A quartermaster on board has to crawl over the passengers to release the falls via a trigger overhead. After this, the oars are brought out and the boat finally begins to row away from the Titanic. Bride alerts Captain Smith that the RMS Carpathia is en route. Her arrival time is 4 hours. In Boiler Room 5, the team assembled by Fireman Barrett finally finishes drawing the fires in the boilers. Most of the stokers depart, but Barrett and 2 engineers stay behind in the now abandoned boiler room. Boat 3 is lowered away with approximately 37 of its 65 seats taken. In Boiler Room 5, Fireman Barrett is ordered by Engineer Harvey to open a manhole plate in the floor so that they could access controls for the pumps. The cover was removed, but due to the heavy steam from drawing the fires, Engineer Shepard cannot see and falls into the hole, breaking his leg. The 3 men then evacuate Boiler Room 5 and head to the nearby pump room. Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley on the boat deck overhears a rumor circulating that women were to be offloaded on the starboard side and men are to be let off on the port side. He noted that after this rumor began to spread, almost all of the men in the vicinity departed for the aft port side boat deck, causing a large crowd to gather there around the remaining 4 lifeboats. Overhead, the steam noise that had been escaping the funnels and causing problems for the crew on deck to communicate finally ceases. During the loading of boat number 1 on the forward starboard side, passengers are having to climb into the boat, and one first-class passenger, Charles Stengel, after having seen his wife off in boat number 3, climbs over but falls into the boat. Officer Murdoch remarks that this is the funniest thing he's seen all night. In the Marconi wireless room, Junior Operator Bride jokingly suggests to Operator Phillips to begin sending out the new SOS signal, saying it might be your last chance to use it. On the forward port side boat deck, Officer Lightoller is trying to persuade passengers to join Boat 6 as Captain Smith, Officer Wilde, and other crewmen are ushering women and children into Boat 8. Passenger Emma Bucknell recalls while near Boat 8 that men were beginning to grow desperate as only the women and children were being allowed to board. Captain Smith handed Emma a basket of bread after she boarded Boat 8 before turning to the officer in charge of the boat. Smith then said, "There's a light out there. Take the women to it and hurry back as speedily as possible." Officer Murdoch is finding it difficult to get passengers into Emergency Boat 1 on the forward starboard side. Most of the passengers by now had departed for the aft lifeboat stations or had withdrawn back inside the ship or had moved over to the port side, leaving very little passengers remaining to be coerced into the boats. Boat 8 is lowered away from the port side with 25 of its 65 seats taken. A group of around 100 stokers congregate in front of Boat 9. One officer is described to be driving men away from the boat so that the women and children could make their way to it. The stokers then moved out of the way immediately. Boat 1 is lowered away after all nearby passengers willing to enter the boat have done so. In total, only 12 of its 40 seats were taken, 5 by passengers and 7 by crew members to control the boat. Lowering would be halted momentarily on A deck due to it getting snagged on a coaling wire. On the forward port side, Officer Lightoller is short on crewmen after having sent 7 below decks to open the gangway doors. He can only afford to have 1 crewman per boat. On the forward port boat deck, Boat 6 is finally lowered away with 22 of its 65 seats taken. It was also told to row for the light on the horizon, offload its passengers, and then come back. Ultimately, Boat 6 would meet up with Lifeboat 16 after launching, and a transfer of crew would take place, as Boat 6 had been launched undermanned. Passengers in Boat 6 noticed that the initial 5-degree list to starboard had lessened some, but they still had to reach out and push their lifeboat away from Titanic's hull at times as they were being lowered. In Boiler Room 5, Fireman Barrett rushes to climb the escape ladder of the pump room after he sees a wave of seawater come rushing up between the boilers. Most likely the coal bunker door had finally failed after it had filled to a certain amount with water from the iceberg damage. Once Barrett reached E-deck, he saw water making its way up Scotland Road from the bow and immediately departed for the boat deck. Officer Lightoller, along with Officer Wilde, Captain Smith, and Officer Murdoch, headed to Murdoch's cabin, where he opened a locker of Webley revolvers. Lightoller turned to leave, but as he approached the door, Wilde shoved a revolver in his hand along with some ammunition, saying, "Here you are. You might need it." Lightoller shoved the items into his coat pocket and departed back for the boat deck, when he heard Wilde remark, "I'm going to put on my lifebelt." Lightoller then went to retrieve his own lifebelt while he was still inside. After the lowering of Boat 1, much of the crew on the forward starboard side had departed for the aft lifeboat stations. Many of the crew had noticed the growing crowd forming around the port lifeboats, and they were making their way to those stations. The overall mood of most passengers on board begins to change as many begin to realize that something is seriously wrong with the ship. The large group of male passengers congregated near the port aft lifeboat stations continues to grow, and most of Murdoch's crew from the forward starboard lifeboats run aft to assist in subduing this growing crowd. Halfway into Boat 6's descent, the boat tips dangerously down by the bow, and Quartermaster Hitchens calls up to Lightoller for them to hold the forward fall and lower the aft to trim the boat out. When it's level, he calls up that there's no seaman on board to man the oars. A yachtsman is then allowed to step forward, and he lowers himself down into the boat via the falls before it resumes lowering. In the aft well deck, some third-class passengers begin to grow tired of being told to wait for their turn to come up to the boat, and they begin climbing over the aft well deck cranes and making their way up to the boat deck themselves. Officer Lowe has traveled from the forward starboard side to the port aft section of lifeboats, where he runs into Officer Moody. Both officers agree that the boats need to be lowered with an officer on board, and that one of them would take control of boat 14, while the other would take control of boat 16. The two men agree to this and then set about trying to help load the boats. Trimmer Cavil climbs the escape ladder from Boiler Room 4 after seeing water begin to come up from the stokehold plate, or the floor. Stewardess Violet Jessup boards lifeboat 16. As she takes her place in the boat, Officer Moody turns and hands her a bundle, which she realizes is not food, but someone's infant child. Lookout George Simmons in Boat 1 notices as they pull away from Titanic that the liner had now sunk considerably down by the head. The portholes under Titanic's nameplate on the bow were beginning to submerge into the sea. Boat 16 is lowered with 53 of its 65 seats taken. Officer Moody would ultimately elect to not join Boat 16 as he had initially planned, and unfortunately he would perish in the sinking. Trimmer Dillon and Greaser Scott are ordered to grab a lifebelt and go out on deck and have a look around after having seen water coming into Boiler Room 4. Master-at-Arms Joseph Bailey climbs down the falls for Boat 16, and he joins the lifeboat after a crewman noted that there were only 2 crew on board to take charge of the boat. There are virtually no passengers near the starboard aft lifeboat stations due to the ever-growing crowd on the port side. Officer Murdoch arrives at the starboard lifeboats and shouts out to the men, "Are you all ready?" Murdoch then points to a group of nearby passengers. "Pass the women and children that are here into that boat there, number 9. Second Engineer Hesketh in Boiler Room 4 shouts out to the men, "We've done all we can, men. Get out now." What had been a small trickle of water coming into Boiler Room 4's stokehold plate floor was now 1 foot deep. The crew immediately grabbed their lifebelts and evacuated the room. At Lifeboat 14, around 20 or more passengers had been loaded into the boat when the men nearby panic. Thinking that they were supposed to be loaded into the boats and not the women, one man rushes in an attempt to board, and able-bodied seaman Joseph Scarrett has to use the boat's tiller on the man to drive him back on deck. Steward Ray and first-class passenger Martin Rothschild climbed the grand staircase together to the boat deck. Ray had previously just seen water coming up from the lowest landing of the grand staircase a few minutes prior. He immediately set out for his own lifeboat station, Boat 9, after arriving on the boat deck. Officer Lowe climbs into Boat 14 just before it lowers. He asks crew member Joseph Scarrett if the falls would hold, because he fears that they may have overloaded the boat. Shortly after conversing with Scarrett, Officer Lowe turns and sees a man successfully enter Boat 14, but he is immediately ordered out of it by Officer Lowe, who waves his revolver in the man's face. Officer Moody crosses over to the starboard aft section after helping to load Lifeboat 12. He begins to help Officer Murdoch load Lifeboat 9. Officer Lowe, after ordering the man out of Boat 14, turns to the crew on deck and gives the order to lower away. Boat 14 is then lowered with 40 of its 65 seats taken. Down below, Trimmer Cavell decided to re-enter the abandoned Boiler Room 4. He noted that the room was beginning to fill, but not by much, so we set off for boats 13 and 15 on the boat deck. As boat 14 lowered past the A-deck promenade, Officer Lowe saw a large group of what he noted were third-class passengers looking as if they were going to try and jump in. He drew his revolver and fired 3 warning shots, telling them, "Stand back or I'll shoot you like dogs." The crowd of passengers on A-deck moved away from the railing. Back in the aft well deck around this time, stewards finally began calling for third-class women and children to please make your way up and go to the boat deck. Steward Wheat arrives at boat 9 to find crew shuffling passengers over from the port side to starboard in order to fill their lifeboats. He also noted that Bruce Ismay was there helping with the assisting of loading boat 9. Madame Aubert's maid recalled at boat 9, "These English, how brave, how calm, how beautiful. I, who am a patriotic Frenchwoman, say that I can never forget that group of Englishmen, every one of them a perfect gentleman, calmly puffing cigarettes and cigars and watching the women and children being placed into the boats. My last sight of the upper decks was still a group of those Englishmen, cigarettes in mouth, facing death so bravely that it was all the more terrible." Officer Murdoch has boat 13 lowered to the A-deck promenade to receive women and children. The portable suction pipe in Boiler Room 4 is finally connected to the bilge system, and it begins to discharge water out of Titanic's condenser openings between lifeboats number 11 and 13. Meanwhile, on the port side, boat 12 has been loaded and ready to lower for 5 minutes, but the process was halted in order to lower boat 14. It is finally lowered away after boat 14 is safely away from A-deck. As boat 12 is lowered, a man jumps from the boat deck and lands in the lifeboat. Boat 12 was lowered with 42 of its 65 seats taken. On the starboard side, at around the same time that Boat 12 was being lowered, Boat 9 was also lowered with 40 of its 65 seats taken. Boat 15 on the starboard side is also lowered to the A-deck promenade to receive more women and children. Crew on board began to notice a slight list to port as it was lowered down. Bruce Ismay notices first-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum on the boat deck and shouts, "You! What the devil are you doing here? I thought all the women had left the ship." Ismay then takes Rosenbaum by the arm and proceeds to take her down to A-deck, where officers pick her up and place her into Boat 11. Officer Murdoch has overseen Boat 9's lowering and now moves to station number 11, which had already been loading in women and children via the A-deck promenade. Murdoch notices a group of men down below looking like they were going to jump into the boat. He holds them back while shouting, "Women and children first." Boat 11 on the starboard side is lowered away with 50 of its 65 seats taken. The Coronia loses contact with Titanic permanently. It was around this time that Titanic's power began to slowly fade. This had the effect of not only dimming the lights out on deck, but also reducing the range of her wireless distress signals. Periodically over the next half hour, more and more ships would cease to hear Titanic's cries for help, and Titanic would start receiving less and less responses due to the slow loss of power. Officer Murdoch moves to Lifeboat Station 13 and begins to load it and Boat 15 at the same time. Several men on the boat deck jump forward to join Boat 13, and Officer Murdoch again shouts for them to stand back and let the women and children in first. At this time, Fireman Barrett finally arrives on A-Deck Promenade, near Boats 13 and 15. He climbs aboard Boat 13 and noted that only 3 others joined the boat after he did. Up on the boat deck, second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley hears a call from the boats down below, asking him, "Are there any more ladies around?" He responded that there wasn't, and the crew told him, "Well, then you better make a jump for it." 2 ladies would join the boat from A-Deck after Beasley jumped down into the boat, followed by a father, a wife, and an infant child. Boat 13 is lowered away with approximately 55 of its 65 seats taken. Officer Murdoch leaves the starboard boat deck and moves over to the port side to assist in the loading there with the large crowd. Fireman Barrett on board Boat 13 hears someone shout, "Don't let anyone else in that boat. The falls will break," after a kitchen clerk, Paul Mogg, jumps into the boat once it starts to lower. Boat 15 is lowered with 68 of its 65 seats taken. The passengers and crew on board Boat 15 notice that the port list is continuing to grow as the side of their lifeboat begins to rub alongside the Titanic's hull during their descent. This would cause the boat to be damaged or even break from bumping along the thousands of rivets along the Titanic's side. They make attempts to push the boat away from the hull when needed. A man jumps down from the boat deck and lands on a woman in Boat 15. He breaks several of her ribs. Captain Smith returns to the Marconi wireless room, and he informs the operators that Titanic was not going to last much longer. The engine rooms were taking on water and the dynamos might not last. It is currently not known where Captain Smith received this information, as the engine room at this time was still dry. He may have been estimating the amount of flooding when delivering this report. In Lifeboat 5, Third Officer Pittman noted that the last row of portholes under the forecastle head were beginning to submerge into the sea. Senior Operator Phillips decides to go and have a look out on deck for himself to see what was going on. He turns the command of the apparatus over to Junior Operator Harold Bride. Having just received word about the going on of the ship from Captain Smith, Harold Bride sat down at the Marconi key and began immediately sending out distress signals. Captain Smith notices that Boat 2 is about to lower, and he orders for Officer Boxhall to abandon his Morse lamp attempts to hail the steamer on the horizon and to take control of the lifeboat. On A-deck promenade near Boat 4, the crew have finally found the cranks and unlocked the windows, allowing passengers to finally begin boarding the lifeboat. The rigging wire it had been attached to was cut, and it swung away from the hull a short distance due to the port list. Deck chairs were used quickly as a bridge for passengers to crawl into the boat. Lifeboat number 2 is lowered with 24 of its 40 seats taken. In the aft port lifeboat sections, crew helping to load Boat 10 note that the port list is still continuing to grow, causing the lifeboat to swing 2 to 2.5 feet away from the boat deck. Chief Baker Charles Jofflin is near Boat 10 and is tossing children into it over the gap. Jofflin made a note that most of the passengers in the nearby vicinity now were of third class. As boat number 11 reaches the water, the officers have trouble disengaging the falls so that they can row away. The discharge of water from the bilge system directly behind them causes a slight panic to break out amongst the passengers on board. When the falls are finally released and boat 11 begins to row away, many on board feared that they would be pulled down by the suction forces when Titanic sank. Meanwhile, First Officer Murdoch has returned to the starboard forward side of the boat deck, and he begins preparations to begin launching Boat C. On the port side, Officer Lightoller is doing the same for Collapsible D. Marconi operator Jack Phillips is on the boat deck having a look around of the situation. When looking forward to the well deck, he noted a very serious list to port, and that water was beginning to flood the spaces down below. He immediately returned to the Marconi room and informed junior operator Bride of the situation. Bride left the key to put his lifebelt on, but Phillips sat down as if in a trance and continued in desperation to pound out distress signals to the small number of ships still within Titanic's rapidly sinking wireless range. While boarding is underway at Boat 10, a woman's dress catches and causes her to fall. Someone on A deck grabs her at the last moment, and she is able to be pulled back onto the promenade of Titanic and board the lifeboat properly. In Boat 2, Officer Boxhall only has one crew member on board and has to give orders for the passengers to begin rowing from Titanic. They only reach a distance of 100 feet before they stop and watch the liner sink. Boat 10 is lowered with 57 of its 65 seats taken. Boat 4 is lowered with 30 of its 65 seats taken. Boat 4 would row along the ship's hull after reaching the water. It picked up 2 men as they slid down Lifeboat 16's fall lines. A few were rescued from the water before pulling away. They would join Boat 12 later on after the sinking. Captain Smith orders for Quartermaster Rowe to stop firing the rockets and look after Boat C on the starboard side. Rowe stops launching the rockets and helps Officer Murdoch with the lifeboat's preparation. Surviving passengers in the lifeboats noted that there hadn't been a general panic on board until the last of the lifeboats in the aft section had been launched. After that, there was nothing to be heard but cries and screams. Captain Smith looks over the port side boat deck, and he sounds a whistle when he spots Boat 2, shouting, "Bring those boats back. They are only half filled." Officer Boxhall receives this order, and heard Smith add, "Come round to the starboard side," apparently to the after gangway doors, as Murdoch had mentioned to boats 7 and 5 earlier in the sinking. Boxhall complies with this order, and begins to row his boat aft around the stern of Titanic. In boat number 6, Quartermaster Hitchens hears the same order from Captain Smith but flatly refuses to return. When the passengers on board object, he shouts, "We are not going back to the boat. It's our lives now, not theirs." Boat 13 reaches the ocean, but it is pushed aft by the discharge of water. Passengers on board shout up to stop lowering Boat 15 until they are freed, because the strain of the falls is making it impossible for them to release them. Occupants of Boat 15 also begin shouting for the crew up above to stop lowering their boat, but it continues to be lowered. On board Boat 13, Fireman Barrett and another man climb over the passengers to frantically cut the fall lines with a knife and free the boat. They manage to begin rowing away just as the bottom of Boat 15 touches their outstretched hands. Boat 4 reaches the ocean, but the falls have to be cut with a knife. A seaman shouts up that they need assistance in the boat, and Lightoller sends Quartermaster Purkis and another sailor down to join them. Purkis would take charge of the boat as they began rowing away. First-class passenger Emily Ryerson in Boat 4 noted that she was shocked by how far down the ship had sunk when her boat finally reached the ocean. She quickly noted that A-deck was only 20 feet or so from the water, and that she could see water pouring into open portholes at the waterline on C-deck as they began to pull away. At around this time approximately, Officer Lightoller is reported by some sources to have removed a group of male passengers from Boat D with a revolver. The remaining crew on the boat deck form a line and interlock their arms together to prevent men from swamping the lifeboat. As Boat 15 begins to pull away, Steward Nichols on board noted that Titanic's starboard propeller was halfway above the waterline. Around this time, Captain Smith entered the wireless cabin for the final time, stating, "You can do no more. Look out for yourselves." Smith left the room and returned to the boat deck. Junior Operator Bride makes to leave, but stops when he sees Phillips still as if in a trance, pounding out wireless signals in vain. Officer Murdoch has a hard time finding passengers to board Boat C because the passengers are primarily in the stern and on the port side of the ship, but he has managed to fit 42 people into the lifeboat built for 40. Murdoch stands at the ready and calls one more time for anyone else willing to join to get in. White Star Line Chairman Bruce Ismay is nearby and climbs aboard, becoming the last occupant of Boat C. Murdoch turns, acknowledges this, and then gives the order to lower away. Boat C is lowered with 43 of its 40 seats taken. Back in the Marconi room, Operator Phillips is attempting to contact Carpathia 2 or 3 times and tell them that they were abandoning the ship, but he turned to Operator Bride after several seconds and noted that there were no replies. Officer Wilde issues an order to passengers which Lightoller then repeats. All passengers to the starboard side to straighten her up. This was perhaps an attempt to move as much weight to the starboard side of the ship as possible and prevent her from listing any further to port. In boat number 2, Officer Boxhall has rounded the stern, but begins to have doubts about loading in more passengers without getting swamped. He turns and orders for everyone to begin rowing away from Titanic, rather than standing by the gangway doors, which still had not been opened at this time. Quartermaster Rowe in Boat C noted that Titanic had went down significantly during their descent. After loading as many women and children nearby that they could into Boat D, an officer boards and prepares to lower away. Boat D is the final successful launch lifeboat of Titanic, with 20 of its 40 seats taken. As Boat D passes by A deck, the rear fall becomes jammed. The boat settles in the water by the bow, while the crew work to get the aft fall to lower. As the boat sits there, 2 passengers jump from the A deck promenade and join the boat. As they do this, the water is beginning to come over the A deck bulwark and flood the area. Shortly after beginning to lower Boat D, Officer Lightoller takes a look down the crew stairwell just abaft the bridge and sees water on B deck, and it is rapidly rushing up the stairs to A deck. Lightoller climbs onto the roof of the officers' quarters to release collapsible B. Murdoch does the same on the starboard side for collapsible A. Second-class passengers Father Thomas Biles and Father Joseph Perschwitz stand together on the aft end of the boat deck, and they begin granting absolution to the remaining passengers. Thomas Andrews is cited along this time as tossing deck chairs overboard on the boat deck. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride finally abandon the Marconi wireless room. Bride stays behind to help in the preparation of Collapsible B, but Phillips joins a crowd of passengers running for the stern. This would be the last time that Phillips was seen alive. Steward Cecil Fitzpatrick is in the bridge and overhears Captain Smith say to Thomas Andrews, "We cannot stay any longer. She's going." Fitzpatrick was sure that the liner still wouldn't sink, and upon hearing this news, he fainted against the starboard side of the bridge entrance. He collected himself, and then began to aid in the preparation of Collapsible A. Collapsible A is released from the roof of the officers' quarters. 6 or 7 crewmen began to push it aft to its davit station, but due to the port list and a funnel stay wire, it became wedged and they could not get it to budge. Collapsible B is released from the roof of the officers' quarters on the port side, but it lands upside down on the boat deck. Junior operator Harold Bride is trapped underneath it as the water begins to wash over the deck. The movements of Boat B after this are quite suspicious, as it somehow would end up on the starboard side of the ship. The waiting crowd of passengers near Boat A abandon hope of climbing aboard, and they begin running towards the stern as they see water coming over the bridge wing. On the roof of the officers' quarters, Officer Lightoller, after freeing Collapsible B, crosses over to the starboard side and observes Murdoch and his crew attempting to free Collapsible A from the funnel wire. Lightoller then strolls forward before diving off the front of the bridge. Titanic takes a sharp dip down, rights herself, then dips again, and the result is a wave that washes itself over the deck as Titanic continues to pick up speed in her descent. As the water reaches the base of the number 1 funnel, it rips itself from its base, causing the smokestack to fall to starboard, nearly crushing the 2 remaining collapsible boats. Many passengers describe hearing a building noise coming from Titanic, as broken china and distant booms and thuds. Due to the severe angle, the ship's keel begins to fail below the 3rd funnel. This begins a chain reaction of small stress cracks forming in the hull and deck plating inside the ship as it continues to rise. Titanic's power suddenly fails, plunging the ship and everyone around it into darkness. There are some reports that the emergency lighting continued to stay on at this time, but the overwhelming majority of those on the boats stated that the ship went completely black. After reaching a high angle, the ship's keel fully fails, and the ship breaks. The stern remained afloat, by some estimates, for up to a full 5 minutes before sinking again. The water was able to easily bypass the watertight doors and bulkheads due to the hull being ripped away from the inner deck structure during the break. The majority of the passengers in the boats and a few survivors on board stated that the stern sank down by the head before reaching a vertical or near vertical angle before stopping for a few moments. During this time, she turned in a semicircular fashion to port, until her propellers were above the heads of those in the water near Boat A and Boat B. "2:20 a.m. Titanic has finally slipped beneath the waves.